Welcome, Nick.
Yeah, thanks for having me on.
My pleasure. So I think that perhaps we should begin by explaining what your work actually entailed. So you were investigator for the Ombudsperson's office. That's actually the first time I've ever heard the word Ombudsperson. And
Yeah.
I'm not sure that I even fully understood before reading your article what an ombudsman's office, as we would call it, would normally do, what kind of work that entails. So let's start by talking about that a bit.
Yeah. So, well, just the name ombudsman is an interesting thing because it comes from, I think it's Denmark or something like that, one of the Nordic countries. And I think directly translated, the man in ombudsman isn't actually man. It's like it directly translated. It's something like public defender, public investigator, or something like that. So translated, it isn't man, but we've changed it to person because we didn't like having man in the title. But the idea of it is that, you have an ombudsman for all sorts of different organizations. And the idea of it is that it's an independent organization that's there for clients or people who have a complaint or a concern about it, and they can bring that forward and they can have it independently investigated. That's it in a nutshell, really.
So people who have a complaint specifically about state employees of British Columbia in this case.
Yeah. So they would call them, the language we used in the office was authorities. And I think we had like several thousand authorities that we'd investigate. So it's more than just like, your ministries of health or your ministries of education. It's also sort of state companies. Like we've got a power company, BC Hydro there. So there's people complaining about their electric bills. We've got a provincial company that provides auto insurance. So you'd have people complaining about their auto insurance. Professional regulatory bodies, like for lawyers, for medical associations, jails, just all sorts of things, a whole gamut of organizations. University schools, almost anything that's being funded with public money.
Right. And you were an investigator, so that means you were looking into some of the more serious complaints.
Yeah.
Role?
Yeah. So I was on a team. They called it the regulatory programs team, which wasn't that meaningful to describe what the team was. But I mean, we had files, everything from, like I talked about the auto insurance. So we'd get complaints about that. I got complaints about people that were applying for licenses to harvest logs or harvest oysters, or then the next day you'd get a complaint from somebody in jail saying that they're being abused by the guards or they're receiving an inadequate or disgusting diet or something like that. So you never knew what kind of complaints you were going to get. So it was really, really interesting that way, because you get a complaint about an organization that you've never heard of that's providing a service that you didn't even know existed. And then you sort of have to quickly try to become an expert on that and make a determination about whether people are being treated fairly. So it was neat. It was like constantly researching, right?
So you said that you noticed the impacts of DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion ideology starting in the 2010s already. What were the first signs of that? How did it first affect your work at the office?
It first affected my work in the office, just that you notice the rituals starting to slip in. That's how it would start off. Rituals and just a change in tone and things. Like when I'd first started, people were quite scrupulous about leaving their politics at the door and not discussing politics. Like everyone in the government is quite interested in politics and what's going on, because it affects our careers and stuff like that and what we're going to be doing at work. But people would discuss it in such a way, in a nonpartisan sort of way, right? Not in a like rah-rah for this party or rah-rah for that party. But isn't it interesting that this thing has happened? And you'd see that start to shift, where people would, quite openly criticize right-wing right-wing figures and conservative figures and stuff, especially when we had a more conservative government, which confusingly was called the Liberal Party at the time. But
Yes,
people would
same
start,
here.
yeah,
Also the Liberals here. Yes, it's the right wing. Yeah.
in our province, they tried to change their name to escape that, but then have recently been sort of disbanded. So there was no escaping it, I guess. But people would, people became a lot more overtly partisan, and things started slipping in, like land acknowledgments and just sort of casually sort of putting down Canada as a country and taking it for granted that, the existence of things like widespread systemic racism and stuff like that, people would start to speak like these things were a given and stuff like that. But I think the land acknowledgments are really, really quite foundational, because I didn't think a lot about them at the time, but it's a ritual. And it's a ritual that slipped its way in. And once you've started putting up with it and you're doing it, you kind of don't realize until you've been doing it. But once you've been doing it for a few years, it's almost like you've compromised yourself already. And you've also opened the door. If you didn't mind performing this ritual, well, what's one more thing? What's putting your pronouns into your email signature, right? You've already got a foot in the door. Just step through.
Yeah, we have the same thing here, of course, the welcome to country, which is very similar to the land acknowledgement. Although I think that the welcome to country is a little bit more, I prefer to the Canadian style land acknowledgements, because it at least ends by saying something like, we celebrate all Australians, which is a nice sentiment to end on. But I find it fundamentally nonsensical, the idea that there's a kind of blood and soil connection between specific groups of people and a country, especially given that there's never any genetic testing of anybody to see whether they really are descendants of the first Indigenous Australians or not. And the definition of who counts as Indigenous is also quite contested, and could be only a few % of your DNA. And I just find it contrary to my liberal and universalist beliefs, the idea that land intrinsically belongs to people as a result of their heritage, rather than belonging to everybody who has been permitted to legally emigrate, and who is part of building the country and being part of a productive workforce, etc.
Yeah, there's a lot of things packed into it. I mean, I think what I sort of take away from land acknowledgements a lot of the time is that it sets up to say, like, here's the status of the land, here's the historical wrongs that have happened, and we are now recognizing that the different people on this land have different statuses here, and I would assume some sort of different rights and different responsibilities here on this land. Like, one of the things a lot of people will add is to say that I'm an uninvited guest in this land, which I always find that one quite wild. I mean, I'd say that's almost a synonym for being an invader, really. And I mean, if you're an uninvited guest, you should obviously leave.
Yeah, that is really odd. Aren't we all uninvited guests on this earth?
I guess, yeah, we are
in a sense.
on the planet. Yeah, if we look at the meta, I guess, yeah.
So you, so things started to become more extreme, moving into the 2020s and the kind of period of peak woke, and there were some quite extraordinary DEI trainings that took place in your workplace. Can you describe some of those trainings? Describe some trainings that you attended, and then maybe we can get on to the specific one that you leaked the details of to Quillette, which upset and embarrassed the people back at the Ombudsperson's office.
Yeah. The first one that I remember was just probably only like 2 weeks after I joined the office. There was a presentation by on trauma-informed approaches to dealing with complaints. It was presented by a lawyer who billed herself as a trauma-informed lawyer. So it's all about, speaking to people and realizing that, they've been through trauma, and approaching everything that way. If they're being upset, that's the reason why. If, they're calling you because they're might be in jail or involved in crime or addicted to drugs or anything like that, you got to look at it through that trauma-informed lens. So some of that's actually pretty useful and pretty true. And I took a lot of things away from that. At one point, the presenter was an Indigenous, and she showed a video, an Indigenous hip hop group, basically saying that they were frustrated with Canada and they were sick of sort of, from what I took from it, sort of performative things from, white Canadians. And then she asked people to comment on it, and I commented on it. She said, "What do you think they're saying?" And I said, "I think they're sick of performative things such as land acknowledgments, which are, they might make the people saying it feel pretty good about themselves, but it doesn't do anything. Like here in Canada, in the places where Indigenous people live, the reserves, a lot of them still don't have clean drinking water, which is a problem that's been known for so many years and still hasn't been solved. There's unresolved land claims in the courts that have been going on forever and ever and ever. We've still got huge disparities and poverty and all sorts of every kind of sort of indicator of well-being and stuff, right? And getting up at the beginning of your team meeting and acknowledging the land and the traditional water keepers and that you're an uninvited guest doesn't really do it, anything at all to solve any of that. And the presenter was actually like, she took that in stride and said, yeah, those are all valid criticisms. Actually, a lot of Indigenous people, feel the same way, and rolled with it. So I thought, okay, I'm here in an office and they're presenting a lot of this stuff, but it seems to be okay to provide feedback and stuff like that. I had a few staff members who said, hey, that was a good comment. Like, thanks for saying that. So I thought I was in a fairly free thinking place, and I noticed, like, in the office too, there would be a lot of heated debates about fairness issues all the time. And people didn't seem shy about speaking their minds, even if they're speaking to somebody senior than them. But there was more and more of these sort of ideological training sessions. And the one where I first got myself into trouble, there was a presentation by a lawyer, a trans lawyer, non-binary, going by they, them pronouns, who's like a fairly significant person in the legal community here in Canada. She's appeared at the Supreme Court of Canada, billed as an expert in sort of transgender legal issues. So she gave a presentation that was really a lot of stuff that I would say is like, just plain nonsense, that, biological sex is just a social construct. The different gender roles that exist were, colonially imposed on First Nations people here in Canada. They didn't really exist before that. That we were obliged to treat anyone by their expressed gender, not their sex, in any situation, including policy situations and legally and stuff like that. So all sorts of, we've heard, any Quillette listener, they know the standard rigmarole, really. Mm-hmm. And when there was time for questions, I put up my hand and I tried to ask a question, the gist of which was, this is all super contentious. How do we speak about this respectfully? Because there's a lot of people who believe that sex is an important thing for policy and it's still relevant. And we need to be able to talk about that without people who raise that being called bigots. Because there's a lot of people who feel that way. And there's very logical reasons for them to do so. And the presenter just went up one side of me and down the other, just basically interrupted me, let me know that she wasn't going to tolerate the bigotry that I was doing, equated it with being racist to Black women and keeping them out of bathrooms, raised the specter of genocide and dog whistles and all those things. So I shut my mouth, said thank you for berating me, basically, and was quiet about it. I had a few people reach out to me in the office and say, I think you were right. But a few weeks after that, I was disciplined for it. I was called into a meeting, and I was let the powers that be let me know that wasn't okay. You can't question these things.
We actually have so we have recordings from that, I think, or yes, we have a recording of your interaction with this person who I think her name is, I'm not going to use they, them pronouns because
no, because they're
non-believer.
silly.
I'm a non-believer and non-binary, and I think my religious views on that should be respected. But her name is Adrienne Smith, I believe. She's also a poet, and I'm actually quite fond of her poetry. I heard some poetry that she performed on stage. She performed some love poetry that she'd written, and I actually quite liked the poetry, and I thought she performed rather well. But that's completely different from this, completely relevant to this topic.
I missed out on that sensitive artistic side that she has. Maybe under different circumstances. Yeah.
But I was struck by how Canadian your interaction was. You were so polite. You were like, "Oh, I'm really sorry," and then that was the end of the conversation. It's quite
I reverted to type, I guess. Yeah.
It seems absolutely extraordinary that this was considered a disciplinary manner, because you were so mild and restrained in your objections. You didn't even say, "I think this is nonsense." You just said, "We should perhaps consider that this is controversial. Not everyone agrees," etc. There was nothing that you said that was would in any way have been objectionable to a normal listener, as far as I can tell. This was not some fiery. You're not some fiery, gender critical campaigner.
Well, I think they would argue that what I did was even more dangerous, because I, instead of just coming out and saying it, I dog whistled, right? I dog whistled and tried to couch it in polite language and stuff like that. So you're really damned either way, right? If you come out and you bang your fist on the table and you really say, I think this is BS and I'm not going to stand for it, well, then you're angry and you're terrible and you're on the verge of committing violence and stuff. And then if you try to be polite and really engage and try to, respect their views and stuff like that as well and bring them in, then you're just couching the dog whistles of genocide in the polite language of rationality or whatever, right? So there's no winning. You're evil either way, unless you just toe the line.
I thought the other interesting thing was, so your boss, when he called you in, if I'm remembering correctly, so please correct me if I'm wrong, he suggested that you needed sensitivity training because what you'd said could have been seen as offensive. So you asked, "Did you find what I said offensive?" And he just hedged on that. He clearly wasn't able to honestly say that he did find it offensive, because it was just so polite and Canadian. There's just no way. And so he said, "That's irrelevant. The person concerned found it offensive, so you have to go to the training." And he asked you if you would voluntarily go, and when you said no, he said you would be forced to go. So that's just a very surprising and I think, in a sense, very typical way of dealing with these issues is the perception is more important than the reality. Someone was offended, and therefore you need to be retrained. You need to apologize, etc.
Yeah, no, that really is how it went down, and I felt like he kind of, as they say, said the quiet part out loud there, because he really did just say it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter if what you said was offensive. What matters is that people found it offensive, and I remember just thinking like this is wild. Like this is we're not following any kind of rational reasoning here at all. And the it was even more wild because he had started the meeting by saying, in that training session, I at first didn't understand why Adrian got so upset with you. I didn't get it. I didn't know where that strong reaction came from. And then people educated me on sort of transphobia and how it works and stuff like that. And now I understand. So he was even admitting that, he couldn't find anything offensive and didn't even know what was wrong whatsoever in the beginning. But now he did. And I had to take training regardless. I mean, he should have come to the training with me, I guess, if he hadn't understood why it was offensive either. We both should have gone and taken it, since obviously neither of us understood what was offensive about it. But
There was also, I mean, you cited this. You cited Adrienne as saying that among other hardships she'd had to endure and prejudices she'd had to endure in the past, one was that at her workplace, there were men's bathrooms and women's bathrooms, and there were no bathrooms for people of a hermaphroditic third sex, and
yeah,
therefore she
not
couldn't
even
use the toilet.
it wasn't even a place she'd worked. She said she'd gone for a job
Oh,
interview there.
okay.
I wondered if she'd gone to the job interview just so that she could storm out in anger that there was no third sex bathroom in there. But yeah, this is, if there isn't a problem, I think people like her will find one, because I mean, if your mission is social justice and fighting for social justice, I mean, you need an enemy, you need a bad guy. Your whole identity is swept up in this, so you're going to be finding things, and not even, like intentionally making them up. Like I do think that probably Adrienne genuinely feels that she's fighting a really important battle for social justice and civil rights and things like that. Like I don't doubt the sincerity of her belief in her cause and that it's right what she's doing. But it's a case of confirmation bias, really. If you assume that the entire world is systemically racist and terrible and everyone's out to get you and stuff like that, you're going to find things to confirm that belief.
It also seems we are rewarding that kind of that sense of victimhood. We're rewarding the idea that there are if you belong to certain identity groups, you are likely to be systemically and frequently and intrinsically victimized. And you talked about some ways in which you actually changed practices of the Ombudsperson's office in response to some social justice demands. For example, you
Yeah.
changed the way you prioritized and also the way you dealt with complaints. Tell us
Well,
about that.
I don't know if this has happened. So these were changes that were in the works when I was
Okay.
there. So it kind of starts with some new legislation that has come in BC. I can't remember the name of it, but it's something like the Collecting Anti-Racist Data Act or something like that. So it mandates that the government will collect like race-based data on everybody that is accessing services or interacting with it, right? So there's in your government file, there's a field being added to collect things like your gender identity, and your like race or ethnic background or what have you, right? Um, so they were in the process of complying with this act at the office, and they're discussing like how are we going to use this data. And they're saying, this is what we think we're going to do. And the DEI committee kind of went around and was doing the rounds, letting people know this is how they're going to do it. It was one of those things where they're checking in and consulting, but you can tell that their minds are already made up, right? They're just running it by and ticking the box. And what they're going to do is, somebody calls, they've got a complaint, they collect race-based data from that person. And if that person self-identifies as someone who's in one of these groups that we've decided are victimized, then automatically the investigator that gets assigned this complaint will automatically do a little assessment on whether or not there was racism or transphobia or any of those things, whether that happened. So, which I describe as a witch hunt, really. It's a pretty ridiculous thing to do if somebody hasn't complained whatsoever, that race was any sort of a factor in what happened to them. They might have had an interaction with someone where the other person didn't know what their race was or something like that. But, still you'd have to do a little mini assessment on that. And also they'd prioritize people's complaints. So the office was super duper busy. People would often have to wait much too long to have their complaints dealt with. And we'd prioritize people's complaints, based on the severity and stuff like that. So if you've got somebody who's saying, I'm calling from the jail, I'm in solitary confinement, I haven't been fed in 3 days and the guards are torturing me. Well, you got to look at that one pretty soon, right? That person can't wait 2 months. So the new way that they're going to start prioritizing it is, based on race. It was pretty point blank on that, which I thought was just wild. They want to talk about systemic racism. It doesn't get more systemic than that.
You had a lovely phrase in your piece. You said something like, there's no point in investigating complaints that people haven't made, say complaints about sexism or racism that they haven't made. And you said, most people are pretty clear as to what they're complaining about. I've had that phrase covered a multitude of sins. It was very telling. Most people are quite frank and upfront in expressing how they feel.
They do. They know why they're upset when they call you. I've spent quite a long time dealing with complaints. I worked for a total of almost 4 years at the Ministry of Health, fielding complaints about healthcare, anything that happened in hospitals and things like that, and then another almost 2 years at the Ombudsperson's office. So I've dealt with a lot of complaints, and people know why they're upset, and they tell you why they're upset. And sometimes they are upset that they think they've been discriminated against. I was treated this way, I think, because I'm a woman, or because I'm transgender, or because of my race. And people come right out and tell you that. They're not scared to let you know what happened.
Yeah, I can imagine. So tell me a little bit about the DEI training, the details of which you leaked to us at Quillette. So you didn't actually attend this training, but you did you did receive some of the materials, in particular the slides. And I think there were more than 100 slides, if I'm recalling correctly, which had been used in the meeting. And those were sent out in a company-wide, organization-wide email on your mailing list, I believe, or on your intranet?
No, they were posted to the office intranet site, we could go on and upload them there. So yeah, I'd stopped going to all these training sessions after that disciplinary meeting I'd had, because one of the things I'd mentioned in that meeting is that I think these are ideological, and it's inappropriate that you're forcing me to go to things that are ideological. And then I can't even object to or even point out the fact that they're ideological. And then I was told, well, these aren't required. It's expected that everyone would want to attend, but it's not required. So, okay, I won't attend, which was not the message I think I was supposed to take away from that. But that's what I took from it. And I didn't attend them anymore. But I came in after this session on decolonization, and like the office was really a buzz about it. Like this was really a thing, and even the people that I describe as quite woke in the office are saying like, yeah, that was a little offside. That was I think they went a little bit too far on that one, and I couldn't resist taking a peek and looking on the office internet and looking at the slides, and I was just blown away by them. Like it was just so farcical, the things saying that, the Nazi regime, I think, and apartheid South Africa were inspired by the Canadian Constitution. Like you just imagine Hitler sitting there poring over the Canadian Constitution, thinking like, aha, like it's
and you actually they actually used Mr. Bean to illustrate that, which I thought
for some reason
unintentionally appropriate because it was so ludicrous.
Yeah.
So Mr. Bean was taking the role of Hitler, which seems very unfair to Rowan Atkinson, I must say, and and was kind of peeking over at the Canadian Constitution and copying the homework. It's from an absurdist Mr. Bean sketch.
It was really something. But then it was like a constant, a whole bunch of juxtaposition throughout the whole thing about, settler society and capitalist society is bad and evil and focused on greed and just complete individualism and amassing wealth and all of that. And then Indigenous society is, everyone's working together, consensus, care for the earth instead of polluting it and destroying it. Just childish, really. It was just like childish tropes, like, it made something click for me because I'd met with the Ombudsperson himself a month or two before that. He'd put out a call saying if anybody would like to talk with me and have a one-on-one, come on in and do that. So I did, and we beat around the bush for a little while, and then I said, I think there's, ideology is really seeping into this office, especially around the training sessions. And I think we're doing a disservice to the office, which is, is very important for it to be impartial. Like of all offices, it depends on being impartial more than anything else, I'd say. And it's really inappropriate. And I think we should think about that. And, we talk about diversity a lot in our office, but diversity of opinion seems to be, respected less and less and less all the time. And, he kept his cards close to the vest, but I hoped that he took some of that to heart. And then, a month or two later, that presentation goes on and I say, okay, obviously not taken to heart, whatsoever. So this is where I work and it's not getting better. It's only going to get worse. They don't care what I say about it. Like saying stuff that's just going to get me in trouble. So I felt like I have to do something. So I didn't really think about it very much. I just like, I'll just put this out into the world then and leaked it.
What was anybody else pushing back against that stuff at the office? Were there any other troublemakers, disagreeable people?
Yeah, I could, it was an office of over 100 people, and I could count the people that would ever say anything publicly on less than the fingers of one hand. So most people wouldn't. Most people sort of, even people that disagreed, they're like, yeah, it's getting weird around here. I just keep my head down and do my own work and mind my own business, sort of thing. And there's like some notable exceptions of people that would, more discreetly and more strategically than me probably would speak out in some settings. But for the most part, people would go along, right? Like if you're there, you want to advance within the office. You're not going to advance within the office by speaking out against these things that have become like sacred and verboten and dogmatic and stuff, right?
I think the stuff about the I saw a couple of slides which were about how the First Nations Canadians had this utopian society and they didn't have a concept of ego They had no concept of men and women, and it was just one big hippie love-in. And I wonder how they were even able to get away with those kind of claims, because quite a lot is known about the First Nations. And at Quillette, we're actually running an extremely detailed multi-part history of early Canada. And when the first settlers arrived in Canada, and it was very, very different from the situation in the United States, because it was mostly people who were coming and doing fur trapping and trying to establish trading outposts. So they didn't bring their wives and children. This is the Europeans. And they didn't settle Canada until much later in quite the same way as the United States. And it was never a penal colony, nor was there organized chattel slavery going on. But they found a very complex society among the First Nations, a complex trading society with rivalries and alliances and occasional battles and skirmishes. And it was obviously in some ways more primitive than Europe. It was more technologically primitive.
Technologically,
also, yeah, and in some ways more socially primitive, because this is smaller, more isolated groups. So there's less exchange of ideas. But nevertheless, this was quite a complex and well-developed society. This was not this was not a kind of naked love-in.
Yeah, well, I mean, the American Constitution was inspired by the Iroquois government, right? So there were some complex social things happening as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it's kind of it's weird to me.
It's so strange. It's so strange, and it does such a disservice to Indigenous people and to their history to just cast them as this. It's going back to that noble savage trope, really. Like these are just people that were victims and lived this sort of Ewok-like existence beforehand, where like other peoples in the world, they were complex and interesting and fascinating. Like I'm working my way through that Quillette series, and it's so interesting and it's so cool. And what these like simple narratives trying to teach them, I think it's not going to make racism better or understanding better. I'm kind of struck by one of the things one of my kids said to me a while ago, because these tropes are the same tropes that are being taught in our public schools here in Canada, right? It's, Indigenous history and things like that are parts of the curriculum, as they should be. But what gets delivered is really all this exact same stuff that, before colonizers came here, Indigenous people lived one with the land, and that's kind of all you learn. And one of my kids came home and said, like, in a sarcastic voice, like, I was like, what did you learn in school today? I was like, oh, just another day of learning about like how special and perfect Indigenous people are. And it's making like my kids jaded about it. Like, I had to be like, no, like there's actually tons of interesting stuff about Indigenous history. There's like super cool cultures then and now and stuff. And it's like, why are we doing this? This education, it's not even doing the thing that they want it to do. Like, even if it was a white lie to reduce racism, it's not. It's doing the opposite.
No, absolutely not. I think that's just a reluctance to celebrate Canadianness, because this could be just folded into an interest in the country, in its history, in its culture. You could see this as a continuity. And which doesn't mean that you have to whitewash bad things that happened in the history, but you could celebrate it all as part of one Canadian story. And instead, they want to create this Manichaean division, and that's what that falsifies everything. Even falsifies the more positive parts of, and the more enriching parts of the First Nations history and culture.
Yeah, very much so. And we also have a strange complex about the United States, and seem to have a a difficulty separating our history and culture out from theirs. So I think a lot of the times, we just plug in Black slavery and with our issues here, and even though these are separate things, they're different. They've got their own, harms and history and everything like that. But we just kind of substitute the labels and just treat them as the exact same history.
Mm-hmm. I wonder why. I mean, sorry, I'll start this again. Maybe this is availability bias on my part because because our editor Jon Kay covers so many Canadian issues, and he tends to cover Canadian craziness, which the Canadian media don't want to touch because it might be a bit politically incorrect, or even requires a lot of legal fact checking, which they may not want to do. They may want to avoid potential trouble. So we're often covering the more extremely woke stories in Canada. And I'm following Jon also on Twitter, and he's often tweeting about some quite absurdly woke Canadian stuff. And I do get this feeling that culture, that peak woke culture of 2020, the kind of whole Black Lives Matter, identity politics, crazy stuff, really took hold in Canada in a particularly deep and tenacious way. Do you feel that's true? And if so, do you have any theories as to why?
Well, it was already building a lot before the pandemic. It was already well entrenched, and it just hasn't gone away. Why that's happened here, I don't know. I mean, I live in Victoria in Canada, so it's probably about the most woke city that there is in the whole country. So I can't say that my experience is representative. But why it's happened here, like I don't know. I don't know. I don't have a good answer for it. It's kind of puzzling. I mean, you can look at it. It sounds like in a lot of ways, maybe New Zealand has had a lot of the similar things. I don't know if there's similarities. Yes. It sounds like Australia has had a lot of the same things too. So is there some similarities between Commonwealth countries that have, not been able to let go? Maybe we don't have that same free speech tradition as the United States does, more of a deference to authority.
I think there might be a lack of pugnacity and appetite for disagreement and for argument. I think that there is part of the kind of diversity, equity, and inclusion rhetoric to me seems to be about smoothing over differences, ignoring people who disagree, or keeping them in polite silence, and creating a consensus. And of course, it is valuable to have a consensus on some issues, but it's also often really valuable to allow people to be cantankerous old gits and argue about stuff and and push back and stress test ideas and practices and things. And I think that culture of disputation and argument doesn't seem to flourish as well in the especially in the kind of former British and European colonies in the Commonwealth countries. That's my sense. And when I was in India, I felt wokeness was never able to take hold in the same way because Indians are way too argumentative. So you just can't make an assertion without there being a big row. I am generalizing a lot here, but it seems to me that the one kind of diversity that we're neglecting is diversity of opinion, because diversity of opinion is really uncomfortable because you end up arguing with people. And I think that, well, countries outside of the motherland diaspora communities tend to be more conservative, tend to be stick together more closely, and therefore there is, I guess, less argument feels more threatening. Maybe there's something in that.
Yeah, I think there's got to be something. There's got to be something in that. I mean, like a less polite way would be to put it that we really have a bit of a culture of spinelessness too, like where people are just scared. People are scared, and with good reason. And I include myself in the legions of the spineless. Like I spent a long time, not doing what I thought was right because I was scared.
Mm-hmm. Well, you have responsibilities, family responsibilities.
Yeah, it's really hard when you've got family to take care of and stuff like that. And is it really worth risking your kid's future over that you don't like land acknowledgments or something silly like that? Or why can't you just say they them instead? Over something so silly, right? Why would you? Why wouldn't you just go along? But yeah, I don't know. I think a lot of what you said must have something to do with it, but there definitely is a cultural something that makes it hard for us to stand up and push back. Even when you look at like a lot of the polling that there's, even in Canada, woke Canada, the majority of people don't subscribe to woke values. The idea that our country is systemically racist and that people can change sex and things like that. You take an issue like males in women's sports. I think it's getting close to 80% of people don't think that should be happening at a competitive, like elite level anyways. And yet, 80% of people think it. And yet in so many places, like in polite society, it can't be said. It's really bizarre.
It's also, as you pointed out in your article, there's a kind of institutionalization that happens to people, which I'm familiar with from academe, from back in the day when I was in academe, where you are trained for your one specific job in at universities, in higher education, or also in a very similar way in public service. And it's quite hard to move sideways from that. You're not really qualified for anything else. But you can be just locked into the job for life if you keep your head down, play your cards right, don't rock the boat, etc. So there's definitely a conformist culture is welcomed and is encouraged in those sorts of situations, and it leads to situations in which these institutions, which are taxpayer funded and supposedly representative of the whole country, become very, very one-sided little echo chambers.
Yeah, very, very much so. Well, and I think it is quite incredible. Like I'm not one for conspiracy theories at most times, like especially government conspiracy theories. Like having worked in government for a long time, I always think it's hilarious when people say like something like the COVID vaccine has microchips in it and it's a gigantic conspiracy between Bill Gates and the government with the US Air Force. And I'm like, if you worked in any of these institutions, you'd know that like they don't have the administrative ability to do any of these things. Like even if they wanted to, like it would never get out of committee. Like they just can't do it. They just can't do it. But it does feel like something overarching, like how people, they have very strategically grabbed onto the levers of power, not the democratic levers of power, really, but like HR departments, and education, like teacher education departments in universities, which is strategically like really, really, really clever. Like you think,
Mm.
let's train the people, like let's indoctrinate the people that are going to be the teachers and are going to teach the children. Like it's just, I mean, it's really genius, a lot of it, right? And they've created sort of a system where a lot of people in senior levels are quite scared of their juniors and don't feel like they can push back at them when it comes to these sort of dogmatic things. It's quite wild.
That's really surprising to me also. I think that's a large cultural shift that's happened, that people are, for example, I um, I have I know of cases in which publishing companies have decided not to publish a book because one or two junior staffers complained about the content of the book. Um, Also, recently, an article which we managed to publish was actually killed by another outlet, and it was killed because a junior staffer objected, somebody who wasn't even working on the article. Um, and that seems like a big change.
Yeah, I think it's quite extraordinary. And I think, I didn't know the senior people well at the ombudsperson's office, but the impression I got wasn't that the ombudsman himself or the senior leaders were true believers in any of this stuff. I think they were just pure self-preservation, and I felt like the leaders and the people that were true believers were like younger activist staffers who were on the DEI committee, and
Mm.
these were the people that people were scared of running afoul.
Mm. You also had all kinds of quite Orwellian, amusing language, some of which you cited. For example, certain groups, racial minorities, and also sexual minorities were described as equity deserving groups, which is just, if you unpick that phrase, that's so extraordinary. Like other people don't
Yeah.
deserve equity. What does the concept of equity mean if only some groups are equity deserving? It's just.
Well, it's shifted. Interestingly, when I first got to the office, it was equity seeking groups.
Mm,
Then it
mm.
shifted to equity deserving groups. And then I just heard somebody from that milieu talking, and they said equity denied groups. So
Oh.
it's moving on and on. So they've been seeking the equity, but the equity has been denied. I guess they deserved it, but unfortunately, it's been denied. Um,
and and also nomadic was one of the terms which was considered a slur, and instead you have to use seasonally chosen movements or something. People have seasonally
yeah,
chosen movements. It's so strange.
I can't even unpack that one. I don't have the correct degrees to pull at those threads. I'd just get myself all tangled up because it doesn't make sense. Um, but I mean, equity is one that it's a concept that I think has been terribly abused. Um, like and I think universally, for the most part, people believe in equality, that everyone should be treated the same. Um, but then equity is the idea that, you know, even if you treat everyone the same, everyone's not going to end up with the same outcomes. And, some of that is for reasons that are outside of people's control, like if I
Mm,
have rich parents, that's, I'm probably I have a better chance of ending up successful in life because I'm going to go to the right schools and I'm going to meet the right people and all of those things. And you can apply those then to any sort of identity marker as well, right? Or life
mm,
circumstance or something. So there's something to that, right? Like if we're
mm,
going to help people out in society, we should help out the people that could use the help the most. Like it doesn't make sense for the government to say, there's a lot of injustice and a lot of poverty in the world. So we're going to give $1,000 to everyone. So you're giving $1,000 to Bill Gates and Elon Musk, and so they really don't need it. Like, that's not equitable, right? They're not poor. But then it turns into these absurd things, right? Like, one of the things that really sort of turned my head at the beginning of the pandemic was when the vaccines were first rolled out, and before they were quite so controversial, most people were like, I want to get the vaccine. I'm scared of COVID, and I don't want to get it. And here in BC, at least, you were able to get it sooner if you were Indigenous. There's no science saying that the vaccine works better on Indigenous people or anything like that. Is just because they have like poor health outcomes generally, because of a lot of different things. So, I mean, you could scale that down. We could have taken it further. I don't think we did, right? But it was just, Indigenous people can get it at this age. You have to wait longer if you're not Indigenous. I mean, you could have broken it down further and checked all different ethnic groups and stuff like that and assigned medicine that way. But I found that quite sinister. We're doling out healthcare based on people's race. Like, this is very strange.
Mm. I think, where the vaccines are concerned, certainly age seems to have been the main factor in susceptibility to bad outcomes from COVID. But I think I'd be more sympathetic to evidence that Indigenous Canadians are more susceptible to, are more likely to die of COVID, and therefore we should give them vaccines first. I think I would be more sympathetic to that, but a lot less sympathetic to the idea that your complaint should be handled first because you're Indigenous, rather than because it's more pressing and urgent in itself.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I don't think there was any such evidence that it was, COVID related of any kind. Like, I think it was more that, Indigenous people being in poverty, a lot of them are facing a lot of the diseases that come with poverty and stuff, right? So, I mean, it would be much more effective, like, let's target the vaccine to people that are in poverty then. But
yeah, absolutely. Yeah, well, it always seems to me that it's more effective to target the people who are in need rather than the people who are members of a specific group, because you don't experience things as a group, you experience things as an individual. So if you're impoverished as an individual, it doesn't matter if other people in your group are wealthy, and vice versa. If you're wealthy, it doesn't matter that other people in your group are impoverished. And so I've never understood this targeting by groups. In most cases, there might be a few exceptions where it does make sense, but mostly it just doesn't seem to make sense.
Yeah, no, and I think it's a huge, like, just practically and from a public relations standpoint, it makes these things like such a loser, really, when you roll them out, because you're not targeting the right people a lot of the time. It's like race or something like that is serving as a proxy for something else, right? When what you're really trying to get at is poverty. And yeah, then you're losing a public relations battle because it builds resentment among other groups and things like that. Where, yeah, if you're trying to solve poverty, let's target things at people that are poor. If you're trying to increase education, let's target education programs towards people who aren't educated.
Nick, is there anything you wish I had asked you that I haven't asked you, or that you'd like to talk about that I haven't given you a chance to talk about?
Well, I'd just like to say to, other public servants and stuff that are out there that we hear a lot of stuff about, universities and the education system and things like that, and sort of how woke ideas are causing all sorts of problems there, but you don't hear about it so much in the bureaucracy. But the bureaucracy that's functioning in the background, it's going through these same struggles. And I really hope, other people that are in the public service, that they find some inspiration to try to take some sort of a stand or do some sort of action. It doesn't have to be anything dramatic. You don't have to, blow up your career or anything like that. But there is something that you can do. And it's probably going to be uncomfortable and it's probably going to be a little bit scary, but it's not the worst thing in the world having somebody say something mean to you, right? You'll survive that. Sticks and stones can, break your bones, but the words really, they're not going to hurt you unless you give those people the power to hurt you. So I hope people start getting brave because it's important. It's really important.
Well, thank you so much, Nick, for being an inspiration in that regard.
Well, thank you. I appreciate that. And again, thanks for having me on.
My pleasure.